Welcome to London Gritty Chronicles. I am your guide through the foggy streets of the past. Today, we are not just looking at a disease. We are looking at the moment the world broke and how it was put back together in a completely different shape. This is the story of the labor shortage after 1350. This is the story of how death accidentally created the modern worker. Imagine a field in England in late summer, shortly before the year 1348. The sun is hot on your back. The air smells of wheat and sweat. If you look around, you see people everywhere. The land is full. Every inch of soil is being farmed. There are so many villagers that there is barely enough food to go around. In this world, life is cheap. If a worker dies, there are 10 more waiting to take his place. The lord of the manor holds all the power, and the worker holds none. Now, close your eyes. Fast forward just 3 years to 1351. Open your eyes. The same field is silent. The wheat has rotted on the stalk because there are no hands to harvest it. The village nearby is ghost quiet. Half the cottages are empty. Their doors swing open in the wind. The lord of the manor is still there, in his big house, but he is terrified. Not just of the sickness, but of the silence. He looks for workers, but there are none. And the few survivors standing in that field, they are looking back at the Lord with a new expression on their faces. They are realizing something dangerous. They are realizing that for the first time in history, they are valuable. This documentary explores the economic shock that followed the Great Mortality, often called the Black Death. We will see how mass death led to a crisis of labor. We will watch the rise of wages. We will see the feudal system crumble. And we will use this history to master the English language of economics, argument, and structural change. Let us begin with the world before the shock. To understand the change, we must understand the status quo. English note. Status quo is a Latin phrase used often in English. It means the existing state of affairs, or how things are right now before a change happens. The status quo of the early 14th century was a system called feudalism. In a feudal society, the economy is a pyramid. At the top sits the king. Below him are the nobles and the church, the major landholders. At the bottom, supporting everything, is the peasantry. Most of these peasants were serfs or villains. This is a crucial vocabulary word. Serf. A serf is an unfree peasant. He is not exactly a slave because he cannot be sold individually like an object. However, he is bound to the land. If the land is sold, the serf goes with it. He cannot move to another town. He cannot marry without permission. And most importantly, he cannot negotiate his wages. In the year 1300, Europe was caught in what economists call a Malthusian trap. English note. Listen to this structure. A Malthusian trap. This refers to a situation where the population grows faster than the food supply. There were simply too many people. In England alone, the population had likely doubled in the 2 centuries prior. This created a specific economic reality. Labor supply was high, labor demand was low. When the supply of something is very high, its price drops. Because there were millions of peasants desperate for land to farm, the lords could treat them poorly. If a serf complained about his work, the lord could simply remove him. there was always someone else desperate enough to take the job. This power dynamic defined the medieval world. It was a world of fixed hierarchy. English note: a hierarchy is a system where people are ranked one above another according to status or authority. The hierarchy seemed eternal. God had placed the lord in the castle and the peasant in the field. To challenge this was not just illegal, it was seen as a sin against the natural order. The economy was rigid. Wages, if they were paid at all, were stagnant. Prices for food were high because there were so many mouths to feed. It was a terrible time to be poor. But nature has a way of correcting imbalances, and the correction that arrived in 1347 was more violent than anyone could predict. It began with rumors from the East, stories of a pestilence in China, India, and Persia. Then, ships arrived in the Italian port of Messina. Then, the ports of France. By 1348, the Great Mortality had reached the shores of England. We will not dwell on the medical details of the bubonic plague, but we must look at the numbers. The statistics are necessary to understand the economic crash. Historians debate the exact figures, but the consensus is terrifying. English note: consensus means a general agreement. When most experts agree on something, we say there is a consensus. The consensus suggests that between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost between 30% and 50% of its population. Some regions lost 60%. Imagine your own city or town. Now, imagine half of the people vanishing in less than 3 years. In the medieval mindset, this was the apocalypse. It was the end of the world. But for the economy, it was a reset button. The immediate reaction was chaos. We call this the short-term shock. Fields were left unattended. Livestock roamed freely through the streets because the shepherds were dead. In the monasteries, where monks lived closely together, mortality rates were even higher. The administrative machinery of the country stopped working because the clerks and scribes were dying. But then, the dying stopped. The plague burned itself out for a time, and the survivors woke up in the year 1350. This is where our main story begins. The year 1350. The survivors looked around. The sun still rose. The rain still fell. The land was still there. In fact, the land was exactly the same as before. The gold and silver coins were still in the chests. The tools were still in the barns. The physical wealth of the kingdom had not disappeared. But the human capital had collapsed. English note: human capital is a modern economic term. It refers to the economic value of a worker's experience and skills. In this context, it simply means the number of available workers. Suddenly, the equation of supply and demand was flipped upside down. Remember 1300? High supply of workers, low value. Now, in 1350, low supply of workers, extremely low. What happens when something becomes rare? It becomes expensive. For the first time in centuries, the English peasant was a rare commodity. The Lord needed his harvest brought in. The wheat does not wait. If it is not harvested, it rots, and the Lord loses his income. He looked for his serfs. Half were dead. The other half were tired. So the Lord did something he had never done before. He asked a stranger from a neighboring village to help. and the stranger asked a question that would shake the foundations of the world. "How much will you pay me?" The Lord was shocked. "Pay you? You should be grateful for the work." But the stranger shook his head. "The Lord down the road is offering 3 pence a day. If you want me, you must pay 4. This moment, this simple negotiation, was a revolution. It was the beginning of the end of serfdom. It was the birth of the labor market. But do not think the lords gave up their power easily. Oh no. The ruling class, the aristocracy, reacted with fury. They saw this rising wage not as simple economics, but as rebellion. They believed the peasants were being greedy. They believed the social order was collapsing. And so, the elite prepared to fight back. They would not use swords this time. They would use the law. They rushed to the king and demanded legislation to force the peasants back into submission. They wanted to turn back the clock to 1347. We will examine this legislative backlash. We will look at a specific law passed in 1351 called the Statute of Laborers. We will see how the government tried to freeze wages by royal decree, and why, spoiler alert, it is almost impossible to fight the laws of economics with the laws of men. The peasants had tasted their value. The lords were desperate to take it away. The stage was set for a conflict that would last for decades. Who would win? The king with his army, or the plowman with his new economic power? The king was furious. It was 1351, and King Edward III of England was facing an enemy he could not kill with a sword. It wasn't the French army. It wasn't the plague. It was the audacity of the common plowman. Reports were flooding into London from every county. They all said the same thing. The peasants were refusing to work. Well, they were refusing to work for the old prices. They wandered from village to village, selling their labor to the highest bidder. They were breaking the ancient contract of feudalism. The king and his council decided to act. They believed they could stop economic forces by writing on a piece of parchment. They created one of the most famous and futile laws in economic history, the Statute of Laborers. English note. Let's look at the word statute. A statute is a written law passed by a legislative body. It is formal and permanent. You might also hear the word ordinance, which is similar but often comes from a slightly lower authority or is temporary. In 1351, this was the supreme law of the land. The Statute of Laborers is a fascinating document to read. It does not sound like a dry economic plan. It sounds like an angry parent scolding a child. The introduction of the law complains about the malice of servants who were dead to the plague. It claims that because so many died, the survivors were now seeing an opportunity to be lazy and greedy. The law commanded 2 main things. 1. Wage caps. No one was allowed to pay or receive wages higher than the rates from the year 1346, before the plague. 2. Compulsory labor. Every able-bodied person under the age of 60 who did not own land must work for whoever asked them. English note. Compulsory means required by law or a rule, mandatory. If something is compulsory, you have no choice. Think about the arrogance of this. The government was trying to freeze time. They wanted to pretend the Black Death had never happened. They wanted the prices of 1346 in the reality of 1351. But here is where history teaches us a harsh lesson about economics. Market forces are stronger than laws. Imagine you are a lord in 1352. Your harvest is ready. It is huge. If you get it into the barn, you make 100 gold coins. If it rots in the field, you get 0. You need 10 workers. The law says you can only pay them 2 pence a day. The workers say, "No thanks, we will go down the road, or we will just subsistence farm on our own patches." You watch the sky turn grey. Rain is coming. If it rains, the crop is ruined. Do you follow the king's law and lose 100 gold coins? Or do you secretly pay the workers 4 pence a day to save your fortune? Almost every lord chose to pay. They broke the very law they had asked the king to create. This created a massive black market for labor. English note: a black market is an illegal traffic or trade in officially controlled or scarce commodities. Usually we think of black markets for banned goods. Here, the banned good was labor at a fair price. The official records show one thing, but the private account books of the manors show the truth. Historians have found these account books. They reveal that, despite the statute, wages skyrocketed. By the 1360s, the wages for a skilled carpenter had risen by 40% or 50%. The wages for a thresher, someone who processes grain, went up even more. The law failed to stop wages from rising. However, it succeeded in doing something else. It created deep, burning resentment. The peasants were now earning more money, yes, but they were technically criminals for doing so. The king's officials would roam the countryside, finding workers who took extra pay. They would fine the lords who paid it, too, but the lords could afford the fines. The peasants could not. This created a sense of injustice. The government was actively trying to prevent the poor from improving their lives. At the same time, something else was happening to the economy. Because the population had crashed, the demand for food dropped. Think about it. Fewer mouths to eat bread means the price of bread goes down. So the peasant was winning twice. 1. His wages were going up because labor was scarce. 2. The cost of food was going down because food was plentiful. This gap between high wages and low living costs is what historians call a rise in real wages. In the late 1300s, real wages were exploding upward. For the common English person, this was the beginning of a golden age. They began to eat better, started eating meat, and drank better ale. They bought better cloth. The elites hated this. They passed sumptuary laws. These laws limited private expenditure on food and personal items. The lords were offended that peasants were wearing nice clothes. They passed laws saying common laborers could not wear expensive furs or certain colors. So, by the 1360s and 1370s, England was a pressure cooker. On one side, a newly confident working class, money in pockets and full bellies. On the other side, a bitter, frightened ruling class trying to use law to crush them back into serfdom. The balance of power had moved. But the political system refused to accept it. Something had to break. Tension was building year by year. The government kept trying to collect fines. And then, to make matters worse, the king started losing a war in France and needed more money. He decided to introduce a new kind of tax for everyone. The economic miracle was about to turn into a violent political revolution. The Golden Age was about to meet the poll tax. A single silver coin, a groat. It was worth 4 pence. In 1381, this small piece of metal weighed enough to crush a kingdom. We are now 30 years after the Black Death. The tension, angry lords and confident workers, has reached a breaking point. Government, desperate for cash, decided to tax the very people they suppressed. This brings us to the village of Fobbing in Essex. It is May 1381. A royal official named John Bampton rides into the village with soldiers. He sets up a table in the village square and opens his ledger. He demands villagers line up for their tax money. Villagers of Fobbing do not look down. They look Bampton in the eye. They are wearing the better clothes they bought with their new wages. They have full bellies, and they have had enough. A representative of the village, a man named Thomas Baker, steps forward. He tells Bampton clearly, "We have already paid. You will not get a penny more." Bampton is shocked. He orders soldiers to arrest Baker, but they do not move. They are surrounded. Villagers with bows and axes chase the tax collector out of town. This was not just a riot. It was the start of the Peasants' Revolt. To understand why they were so angry, we must learn a specific economic term: the poll tax. The poll tax is a head tax levied on every person, regardless of money. The government introduced this tax 3 times in 4 years. The 1381 tax was particularly unfair. It demanded the same amount from a poor plowman as it did from a wealthy merchant. In economics, we call this a regressive tax. For the peasants, this was the final insult. First, lords lowered wages. Now, king took savings with a regressive tax. They realized the system was rigged. The incident in Fobbing was the spark. The fire spread instantly. News traveled from village to village. "The people of Essex have risen." The message crossed into Kent. There, Wat Tyler emerged as leader. He was not a noble, but a roof tiler or craftsman, articulate, angry, and capable. The peasants did not just burn local manor houses. They targeted the bureaucracy, the system of government officials and paperwork that runs a country. The rebels broke into archives. They found court rolls, legal documents recording serfdom, and burned them. They destroyed evidence of their oppression, erasing paperwork binding them to land. By June 1381, 2 massive armies of peasants were marching on London, one from Essex, one from Kent. They were not disorderly. They had discipline and slogans. Their preacher, John Ball, asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" This question means, when Adam farmed and Eve made clothes, everyone was equal. This was a radical, revolutionary argument, challenging the feudal hierarchy. The Black Death's shock evolved. From biological event to market event, now a political, armed revolution. King Richard II, only 14, looked from the Tower of London. He saw the sky black with smoke. Peasants had breached city walls, burning ministers' palaces. The Duke of Lancaster's Savoy Palace was destroyed. Rebels threw silver plates into the river. One looter, trying to steal a silver cup, was executed. They shouted, "We are seekers of truth and justice, not thieves!" The most powerful economic force, the English worker, is now inside the capital. Armed, angry, demanding to speak to the king face to face. They want abolition of serfdom. They want to be free. The boy king has a choice: hide in his tower or ride out to meet them. We will witness one of English history's most tense standoffs. The date is June 15th, 1381. The location is Smithfield, an open space outside London, usually a cattle market. Today, it is a market for England's fate. On one side stands the royal party. The 14-year-old King Richard II sits on his horse, surrounded by a small group of terrified nobles. They are dressed in silk and armor, but they are outnumbered. On the other side stands the great society of peasants, thousands of them. They are armed with rusty swords, axes, and longbows. At their front is their general, Wat Tyler. This is the ultimate confrontation between old feudal order and new economic reality. Wat Tyler rides forward, does not bow, treats King as equal. Wat Tyler calls for water, rinses his mouth, and spits it out in front of the monarch. This is a shocking breach of protocol, showing his power. Tyler makes breathtakingly bold demands: abolition of serfdom, flat rent of 4 pence per acre, and end of lordship. All men shall be free. Basically, Tyler is demanding the end of the feudal economy. He wants a free market. The young king, incredibly, says yes. He promises charters of freedom. The peasants are stunned. Have they won? Is it that easy? But then chaos erupts. Mayor William Walworth, furious at Tyler's arrogance, shouts at him. Tyler draws a dagger. In a flash, Walworth draws his own sword and strikes. He slashes Wat Tyler across the neck. The rebel leader falls from his horse. Thousands of peasants see their leader fall. They knock their arrows, shouting, "They have killed our captain! Shoot! Shoot!" The English monarchy is 1 second from being wiped out. The 14-year-old king does something brave. He rides his horse toward the angry peasants, right up to the arrow tips. He raises his hand and shouts. "Sirs, would you shoot your king? I will be your captain. I will be your leader. Follow me into the fields, and you shall have all that you ask." The peasants are confused. The king, God's chosen representative, offers to lead them. Instinct of obedience kicks in. They lower bows, follow him away from the city. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Once in the open field, the king's backup soldiers arrived. Rebels surrounded, told to go home or die. Leaderless and confused, they dispersed. The revolution was over. The betrayal began immediately. King's soldiers rounded up ringleaders. John Ball, the preacher, was hanged, drawn, and quartered. When a delegation of peasants came back to the king later to ask about their promised charters of freedom, Richard II gave them a cold, famous reply. "Serfs you were, and serfs you are. You shall remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably worse." It seemed like the lords had won. The rebellion was crushed. The leaders were dead. The laws remained in place. But here is the twist. Here is the counterintuitive truth of history. The king won the battle, but he lost the economic war. Richard II could kill Wat Tyler, but he could not kill the law of supply and demand. He could hang the rebels, but he could not invent more workers. The labor shortage was still real. The fields were still empty. The lords still needed the harvest brought in. Quietly, in the years after 1381, the feudal system collapsed anyway. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. The lords realized that if they tried to enforce serfdom too strictly, the peasants would just run away to the towns. So they stopped trying. They stopped demanding labor services, forcing peasants to work for free. Instead, they started paying wages or renting out the land for cash. Serfdom wasn't abolished by a law, it just faded away. It became economically inefficient. By the year 1450, 70 years later, there were almost no serfs left in England. The bondman had become the copyholder, or the wage laborer. A copyholder was a tenant who held land according to the custom of the manor, with their rights written down. In a copy of the court roll, they had legal rights. They were not property. The great mortality had done its work. It had shattered the old crystal vase of feudalism. The king tried to glue it back together in 1381, but the cracks were too deep. The structure of society had fundamentally changed. So, what replaced it? If the lord was no longer the absolute master, and the peasant was no longer a semi-slave, what was the new relationship? It was a relationship based on contract. A contract is a written or spoken agreement, especially one concerning employment, sales, or tenancy, that is intended to be enforceable by law. Society moved from status, who you are born as, to contract, what you agree to do. This is the birth of the modern economic world. We will explore the golden age of the English peasant that followed this quiet victory. We will look at how their diet changed, how their houses improved, and how women found new economic power in this labor-starved world. We will learn the vocabulary of standard of living and disposable income. The fire of the revolt died out, but the warmth of the high wages remained. The king lied. The rebellion failed. The leaders were executed. But walk into an English village 50 years later, in the year 1430, and you might notice something strange. The peasants are smiling. The rebels lost their heads, but their children won the future. We are now entering a period that historians call the Golden Age of the English laborer. It is a time when the common person in England lived better, ate better, and earned more than they would again for another 400 years. Let us step inside a cottage in the 15th century. In the old days, before the plague, this house would have been a dark, smoky hut shared with a cow. Dinner would have been a bowl of grain and water. But look at the table now. There is a pitcher of strong ale. There is white bread, wheat, not just dark rye. And most shockingly, there is meat. Roast beef, mutton, pork. A peasant eating fresh meat? In 1300, this was a luxury for the rich. In 1430, it is a daily expectation. Why? Because of purchasing power. Purchasing power is the value of a currency expressed in terms of the amount of goods or services that one unit of money can buy. Simply put, How much stuff can your wage actually buy? Here is the math of the Golden Age. 1. Wages remained high because the population stayed low. The plague kept returning every few decades, keeping labor scarce. 2. Land was cheap because there were fewer people to rent it. 3. Food was cheap because there was plenty of space to grow it. This combination created high disposable income. Disposable income is the money you have left over after you pay for your basic needs like rent and taxes. It is the money you can spend on fun or luxuries. For the first time, the English peasant had disposable income. And they spent it. They renovated their houses. They built chimneys, so the smoke went out, not in their eyes. They bought colorful clothes. This economic shift also changed the lives of women. This is a vital part of the story. In a world desperate for workers, prejudice becomes expensive. If you need a field harvested, you don't care if the worker is a man or a woman. You just pay them. Women entered the labor market in huge numbers. They worked in the fields during harvest, earning wages that were nearly equal to men. But they also dominated new industries. One of these was brewing. In the medieval world, everyone drank ale. Water was often unsafe. As disposable income rose, people drank more ale. The demand skyrocketed. Women became the primary brewers. We even have a word for a female brewer, a brewster. They also dominated the cloth trade. Spinning wool into thread was done almost entirely by women. This is the origin of the word spinster. Today, this word is a derogatory, insulting term for an older, unmarried woman. But originally, it was an economic title. It meant a woman who spun wool, a woman who could support herself. A spinster in the 15th century didn't need a husband to survive. She had her own income. She could delay marriage. She could choose who she married. This reflects a shift in social mobility. Social mobility is the ability of individuals or families to move up or down the social ladder, class system. Before the plague, if you were born poor, you died poor. Now a thrifty peasant could save his high wages, rent a larger farm, and become a yeoman. A yeoman is a farmer who owns or rents a respectable amount of land. He is not a noble, but he is not a poor laborer. He is the middle class of the countryside. However, we must not be naive. This golden age was a nightmare for someone else. It was a nightmare for the lords. Imagine you are a lord. Your costs, wages, are sky high. Your income, rent, is rock bottom. Your serfs don't listen to you anymore. You are bleeding money. You look at your vast fields of wheat. They require dozens of men to plow, sow, and harvest. Those men are too expensive. Then you look at the hills. You see a sheep. A sheep does not demand high wages. A sheep does not ask for holidays. A sheep creates wool, which is selling for a high price in Europe. And best of all, a flock of 500 sheep only needs one shepherd. The lords began to do the math. Option A, grow wheat. You need plows, oxen, and seeds. You need 20 strong men to do the work. you have to pay those men high wages because of the labor shortage. Result? Low profit. Option B. Raise sheep. You need grass, which grows for free. You need fences. You need one dog and one shepherd. Result? Massive profit. The choice was lucrative. Lucrative is a great adjective. It means producing a great deal of profit. Sheep farming was more lucrative than wheat farming. So, the lords began to transform the landscape. They took the common land, the open fields where peasants had grazed their cows for centuries, and they put up hedges and fences. They evicted the tenant farmers. They demolished the cottages. This brings us to a sad, quiet place called Warham Percy in Yorkshire. If you go there today, you will see the ruins of a church and the bumps in the grass where houses used to stand. It is a deserted medieval village. It was not destroyed by the plague. It was destroyed by sheep. The lord of the manor evicted the villagers to make room for a pasture. This process created a new social problem: displacement. Displacement is the enforced departure of people from their homes, typically because of war, persecution, or, in this case, economic change. The Golden Age contained the seeds of its own destruction. The high wages forced the lords to innovate. They innovated by getting rid of the workers entirely. This sets up the next great conflict. The solution to the labor shortage was to change the economy from farming food to producing wool. England was about to transform from a bread economy to a wool economy. But what happens to the peasants when the lord doesn't need them anymore? In 1350, the peasant was rare and valuable. In 1480, as sheep took over, the peasant was becoming unnecessary. We will watch the green fields of England turn white with wool. We will learn how the wool trade built the beautiful churches and towns we see in England today, but also how it created a new class of homeless drifters. We will learn the vocabulary of commodity and displacement. The sheep are coming, and they are hungrier than the people. Sheep are eating men. This is one of the most famous and strangest quotes in English history. It was written by Sir Thomas More in his book, Utopia. Of course, he did not mean that sheep had become carnivores. He meant that sheep were destroying human communities. Welcome to the paradox of the late medieval economy. In Part 5, we saw the golden age of the work. But every economic action has a reaction. The lords, squeezed by high wages, found a way to fight back. They stopped farming crops and started farming money. The engine of this change was wool. In the 14th and 15th centuries, English wool was the best in the world. It was soft, durable, and highly prized in Italy and Flanders, modern-day Belgium. In the medieval world, wool was what oil is today. It was the premier commodity. A commodity is a raw material or primary agricultural product that can be bought and sold, such as copper, coffee, or wool. Let us look at the spreadsheet of a 15th century lord. Option A. Grow wheat. You need plows, oxen, and seeds. You need 20 strong men to do the work. You have to pay those men high wages because of the labor shortage. Result: low profit. Option B: raise sheep. You need grass, which grows for free. You need fences. You need one dog and one shepherd. Result: massive profit. The peasants who were kicked off their land had nowhere to go. They couldn't just find another farm, as all the lords were doing the same thing. They became vagrants, or vagabonds. They drifted into the towns and cities looking for charity or odd jobs. However, while the countryside was emptying, something incredible was happening in the small towns. The wool had to be processed. It had to be sheared, carded, spun, woven, dyed, and finished. England stopped just exporting raw wool. It started manufacturing cloth. This shift created a new kind of person. Not a lord, not a peasant, but a merchant. Travel to East Anglia, to towns like Lavenham or Long Melford. You will see massive cathedral-sized churches. They are too big for such small towns. They are called wool churches. They were not built by the king. They were not built by the duke. They were funded by local families, the Springs, the Cloptons, who had become fabulously wealthy by trading cloth. These merchants were the early middle class. They had the money of a noble, but the background of a commoner. They were distinct from the old feudal system. They didn't care about honor or fighting on horseback. They cared about contracts, efficiency, and profit. So, the legacy of the Black Death had evolved again. Stage 1. Death creates a labor shortage. Stage 2. Labor shortage raises wages. Golden Age. Stage 3. High wages force lords to switch to sheep. Enclosure. Stage 4. Sheep create a booming manufacturing industry and a wealthy merchant class. The economy was becoming more complex. It was moving away from land as the only source of wealth. Now, trade was the source of power. But this new wealth had a dark side. The gap between the haves, merchants and sheep lords, and the have-nots, displaced vagrants, was widening again. The golden age of the peasant was ending. If you had land/skills, you got rich. If you lost your land to a sheep, you became a beggar. This sets the scene for the end of the Middle Ages. The feudal structure is gone. The king is no longer just a warlord. He has to manage a complex commercial nation. We will fast forward to see how this new merchant class changed the English language itself. Business, not poetry, began to standardize the way we speak. And we will look at the ultimate consequence of this economic shift, the end of the medieval era and the rise of the Tudors. The sheep ate the men, but they also paid for the future. The year is 1476. William Caxton sets up a strange machine in the shadow of Westminster Abbey in London. It is a wooden press with movable metal letters. He is about to print the first book ever produced in England. But Caxton has a problem, a business problem. He wants to sell his books to as many people as possible. People in England do not speak the same language. A person from the north says egg. A person from the south says eiren. If Caxton prints egg, southerners won't buy it. If he prints iron, northerners will be confused. Caxton, a merchant, thinks like a businessman. he needs a standard. He spent 30 years in Flanders trading cloth, the very cloth industry created by the wool boom. He has to choose a dialect. Which one does he pick? He picks the dialect of London. Why? Because that is where the money is. That is where the merchants are. That is where the courts of law are. This is a crucial lesson. Economics drives language. The English we speak today is essentially the London business dialect of the late 15th century. It won the war of dialects not because it was the most beautiful, but because it was the most profitable. The labor shortage in 1350 had fully transformed the culture. The rise of the merchant class meant that literacy was no longer just for monks. If you are a merchant selling wool to Italy, you need to write invoices. You need to read contracts. You need to keep ledgers. So, schools began to pop up. Not religious schools, but grammar schools. They were funded by the wealthy wool merchants. In Stratford-upon-Avon, the Guild of the Holy Cross built a school. A century later, a glovemaker's son named William Shakespeare would attend that school. No wool trade leads to no rich merchants, leads to no school, leads to no Shakespeare. The chain of cause and effect is unbroken. The plague killed workers, which raised wages, which created disposable income, which built the wool industry, which created the merchant class, which standardized the language and funded the schools. But let us look at the macro picture. By 1485, England was exhausted. The noble families had spent 30 years killing each other in a civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. The old feudal nobility was dying out. They were killing each other on the battlefield, and they were going bankrupt on their farms. Into this power vacuum stepped a new dynasty, the Tudors. Henry VII won the crown in 1485. He was a perfect king for this new world. He was not a warrior hero. He was a boring, meticulous, accountant king. He understood that power was no longer about how many knights you had. It was about solvency. Henry VII loved the merchant class. He signed trade deals. He encouraged the wool export. He taxed the wealthy to fill the royal treasury. He realized that a stable economy was the best defense against rebellion. Under the Tudors, the old feudal system was officially buried. The masterless men, the vagrants created by the sheep enclosures, were still a problem. But the government began to see them not just as criminals, but as a social issue to be managed. We are seeing the birth of the state. In the feudal world, your loyalty was to your local lord. In the new world, your loyalty was to the king and the nation. The economy had nationalized. Before we conclude our journey, we must look at one final surprising consequence of the labor shortage. It involves the most powerful institution of all, the church. The Black Death had shaken people's faith. Why did God kill the good priests and save the bad ones? Why did the prayers not work? And the economic boom had made the church incredibly rich, which made the peasants resentful. The labor shortage didn't just break the feudal manor, it cracked the foundations of the Catholic Church in England. And it prepared the ground for the biggest mental shift in history, the Reformation. We will see how economic independence led to religious independence. We will learn the vocabulary of corruption and dissent. The peasant who learned to negotiate his wages was eventually going to negotiate his religion. The year is 1382. We are in a damp cellar in the city of Leicester. A candle burns low on a wooden crate. 5 people are huddled together. They are criminals. If the bishop finds them, they could be burned at the stake. What are they doing? They are not plotting to kill the king. They are not counting stolen gold. They are reading a book. One of them is reading aloud in English. In the beginning was the Word. They are reading the Bible in their own language. This scene represents the final, deepest shockwave of the Black Death. We have seen how the plague changed economy, wages, society, feudalism. Now we see how it changed the mind. To understand this, we must look at the Church. In the medieval world, the Roman Catholic Church was not just a religion, it was a corporation. In fact, it was the largest landlord in England. It owned roughly 1/3 of all the land. When the labor shortage hit, the church behaved exactly like the other lords. They tried to keep wages low. They tried to collect high rents. They collected tithes. A tithe is a tax of 10% of your income paid to the church. But there was a difference. A peasant might forgive a greedy lord because lords are expected to be greedy. But a greedy priest? That felt like a betrayal. The Black Death had created a crisis of credibility. Why did the church lose credibility? The death rate. The plague killed honest priests who stayed to comfort the dying. Cowardly priests ran away and survived. So, the post-plague clergy was often less dedicated and less educated. The money. As the population shrank, the church became relatively richer. They inherited land from dead families. The sight of a fat, wealthy abbot riding a fine horse while the village suffered created anger. The explanation. The church said the plague was God's punishment for sin. But the monks died just as fast as the sinners. The explanation didn't make sense anymore. This anger found a voice in a man named John Wycliffe. Wycliffe was an Oxford scholar, but his ideas were dangerous. He argued that the Pope was not the ultimate authority. The Bible was. And if the Bible is the authority, then the common man must be able to read it. His followers were called Lollards. They wore it as a badge of honor. The Lollard movement is directly connected to our economic story. Think about the new man of the 15th century, the yeoman farmer or the urban merchant. He is independent. He negotiates his own contracts. He manages his own money. He builds his own house. Why does he need a priest to manage his relationship with God? If he is smart enough to sell wool to Flanders, he is smart enough to understand the Gospels. This demand for the vernacular Bible was revolutionary. English note. Vernacular refers to the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region, for example, English, as opposed to a formal or foreign language, example, Latin. The church fought back hard. In 1401, they passed a law called De Heretico Comburendo, on the burning of heretics. They burned Lollards alive to stop the spread of these English Bibles. But just like the statute of laborers failed to stop rising wages, the burning of heretics failed to stop the rising ideas. You cannot kill a market demand with a law. There was a demand for personal religion, and the Lollards supplied it. This period taught the English people a new vocabulary of dissent. English note. Dissent is the holding of opinions at variance with those previously, officially, or commonly held. It is the opposite of consent. The descent was quiet at first. It was underground. But it was growing. The economic independence of the peasant was fueling the intellectual independence of the citizen. By the time Henry VIII arrived on the throne in 1509, the wood was already dry. All Henry had to do was light the match. The Reformation in England didn't happen just because a king wanted a divorce. It happened because for 150 years, the common people had been slowly losing their reverence for the old institutions. They had learned that systems can break. They had learned that authority figures can be wrong. They had learned that their labor had value. We are now approaching the end of our timeline. The medieval world is dead. The feudal manor is a sheep farm. The serf is a wage laborer. The Latin Mass is being whispered in English. In the next part, we will bring all these threads together. We will look at the legacy of the labor shortage. We will answer the big question: how did a biological disaster create the modern individual? We will define the concept of agency and see how it applies to you, the English learner, today. The storm has passed. Now we must survey the new world it left behind. The year is 1500. We are standing on a hill overlooking the port of London. The River Thames is thick with ships. They are carrying English cloth to Antwerp, Lisbon, and Venice. If you listen closely to the people on the docks, you hear something new. It is not the silence of the serf. It is not the angry shout of the rebel. It is the busy, confident hum of ambition. We have traveled 150 years from the Black Death. We have watched the population collapse, the wages rise, the sheep take over, and the language unify. But the biggest change is not on the map. It is inside the mind. The labor shortage didn't just change the price of a day's work. It changed the definition of a human life. It introduced the concept of agency. English note: agency is a high-level academic word. In sociology and history, it refers to the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. Before 1350, a peasant had almost no agency. After 1350, he had a lot of it. Let us compare two fathers. Father A lives in 1300. He tells his son, "You are a plowman. Your grandfather was a plowman. God has placed you here to serve the Lord of the manor. Accept your fate." This is a world defined by fate. Father B lives in 1500. He tells his son, "The village is full of sheep. There is no work here. Take your savings. Go to London. Become an apprentice. Learn to weave cloth. If you work hard, you can become a burgess." English note: a burgess is a citizen of a town or borough, usually with full rights and property. This is a world defined by opportunity. The Black Death broke the great chain of being. Medieval people believed the universe was a fixed hierarchy. God to angels, to kings, to nobles, to peasants, to animals, to rocks. To move up the chain was impossible. It was unnatural. But when 50% of the people died, the chain snapped. The rocks started moving. The peasants started acting like merchants. The merchants started buying land like nobles. The nobles started marrying merchant daughters to pay their debts. The rigid class system became a fluid class system. This brings us to a vital economic concept: incentive. In the old feudal system, the incentive was fear. Work or be punished. In the new commercial system, the incentive was profit. Work and be rewarded. English note: an incentive is a thing that motivates or encourages one to do something. Money is a strong incentive. This shift created a more dynamic, aggressive society. It is the beginning of capitalism. Now, capitalism is a loaded word. It has many meanings. But in this context, it simply means an economic system where private actors own property and trade it for profit in a free market. The English peasant of the 15th century was the first true capitalist of the modern era. He owned his labor. He sold it to the highest bidder. He used the profit to improve his life. But was this world better? This is a question historians debate. The old world was cruel, but it was secure. You knew your place. You knew the Lord would, usually, protect you. The new world was free, but it was risky. If you failed in the market, there was no safety net. You starved. This creates a feeling of anxiety. English note: anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Modern people are anxious. We worry about our careers, our mortgages, our status. That anxiety was born here. When you have the freedom to succeed, you also have the freedom to fail. The London gritty chronicles of the late Middle Ages are the prequel to our own lives. We are living in the house that the labor shortage built. We negotiate our salaries. We move cities for jobs. We believe that if we work hard, we can change our station in life. These are not natural human behaviors. They are learned behaviors, and we learned them in the empty fields of the 14th century. As we prepare to end this documentary, we must look at the final summary. We need to consolidate everything we have learned. We have covered biology, economics, politics, religion, and language. We will do a deep review. I will give you a checklist of the key arguments you can use in English conversation. We will look at the 5 words that define this era. And I will give you a final challenge, a question to test your understanding of how the world breaks and rebuilds. The story of the pestilence is over. The story of the people has just begun. We began this journey in a silent field in 1351. We end it in the bustling streets of Tudor London. The silence is gone. The world is loud with the sound of commerce, argument, and change. We have watched a biological tragedy transform into an economic miracle. We have seen how a microscopic bacteria, Yersinia pestis, managed to do what no army could. It destroyed the feudal system. Let us review the chain of logic one last time. This is your summary for the entire documentary. If you want to explain this historical event in English, use these steps. 1. The trigger. The Black Death created massive mortality. 2. The economic shift. This led to a labor shortage, scarcity of workers. 3. The market reaction. Scarcity gave the survivors leverage, bargaining power. 4. The political failure. The lords tried to stop this with legislation, statute of laborers, but the market was too strong. 5. The structural change. To save money, the economy switched from farming to wool manufacturing. 6. The social result. This created a new merchant class, a standardized English language, and a mindset of individual agency. It is a perfect example of the butterfly effect. A flea bites a rat in Central Asia, and 150 years later, a merchant in London sends his son to school to read a book in English. Before we finish, I want to give you the 5 power words from this series. If you can use these words correctly, you can discuss history and economics with confidence. 1. Scarcity. Noun. The state of being in short supply. Example. The scarcity of labor drove up wages. 2. Leverage. Noun. The power to influence a situation. Example. For the first time, the peasant had leverage over the lord. 3. Mobility. Noun. The ability to move between different levels in society or employment. Example. The post-plague era created social mobility for the working class. 4. Enclosure. Noun. The process of taking over shared land for private use. Example. The enclosure of the fields forced many villagers to move to the towns. 5. Agency. Noun. The capacity to make your own choices. Example. The modern worker has more agency than the medieval serf. History is not just a collection of dates and dead kings. It is a laboratory. The Black Death was a terrible experiment, but the results are fascinating. It teaches us that status quo is an illusion. Systems that look permanent, like feudalism, can vanish in a single generation if the economic foundations change. Today, we face our own shocks. We face automation, pandemics, and shifting demographics. When you look at the news today, do not just see the chaos. Look for the supply and demand. Look for the leverage. Ask yourself, who is becoming scarce? Who is gaining power? The peasants of 1381 did not know they were building the modern world. They were just trying to survive. They were just trying to get paid 4 pence a day instead of 2. But in doing so, they broke the chains of the past. Thank you for walking through the fog with me. This has been the London Gritty Chronicles. Keep learning, keep questioning, and never underestimate the power of a shortage. I am your guide, signing off.